Welcome back to the deep dive. We're really glad you could join us.
Yeah, great to have you with us.
Today, we're jumping into something pretty complex, something that sits right where psychology and, well, the justice system meet.
That's right. We're exploring the relationship between psychology and crime. It's a huge topic.
Absolutely. We want to unpack what psychology can actually tell us about why people commit crimes. That fundamental question.
And flowing from that,
Yeah.
how does that understanding, or maybe misunderstanding sometimes, affect how we think about things like responsibility and justice itself?
Exactly. And for this particular deep dive, we're grounding ourselves in some really valuable documents. These were made available to students by the University of London.
Yeah, it's a great resource base, really helps structure the thinking around how psychology has approached crime over the years. We're very grateful to the university for making these accessible.
We definitely are. And just to be crystal clear from the start, this discussion, this deep dive, it's purely for educational purposes.
Absolutely. We're here to walk through the ideas, the different viewpoints presented in this material, and hopefully help you navigate some pretty complex territory.
And we're really pleased to say this deep dive is brought to you by Sinorbit Academy, Sri Lanka.
Yes, a big thank you to Sinorbit Academy for their support.
And speaking of education, if any of you listening are facing exams soon, maybe using these materials, maybe something else entirely, we really do wish you the very best of luck.
Definitely. Hopefully exploring these ideas together will help things click, help solidify your understanding as you prepare. Good luck.
So our mission today, if you like, is to unpack what psychology says about criminal behavior, explore the big theories.
And grapple with what that means for responsibility and justice. It's quite a journey we've got planned.
We'll be tracing things back, looking at the historical context, how people first started thinking about the criminal person.
Then we'll move through some major psychological theories. We'll touch on Freud and psychoanalytic ideas, then shift to learning theories, trait-based approaches, cognitive stuff.
And we can't avoid the big one, the nature versus nurture debate, right? That's always lurking.
Always. And we'll also look at how crime and psychology get portrayed in popular culture, films, TV, books, which is often, well, let's just say, not entirely accurate.
We've pulled out specific examples from the sources, key thinkers, hopefully some surprising bits to bring it all to life.
Okay, let's get started then. Let's unpack this history first.
So, grounding ourselves historically, the source material points out that both criminology and psychology really emerged as distinct fields in the late 19th century.
That's right. And early on, especially with the influence of European positivism, thinkers like Cesare Lombroso are key here. The focus was very much on the individual offender.
Trying to identify a criminal type.
Exactly. The idea was, could you find something different about people who commit crime? Maybe biological, maybe psychological markers.
Which was quite different from the earlier classical school of criminology, wasn't it?
Very different. The classical view, think late 18th century, saw the offender mostly as a rational actor, someone weighing up pleasure versus pain, gain versus punishment.
So crime was a choice, basically, and the individual was fully responsible.
Precisely. The classical school was about deterrence, making the punishment fit the crime because people were assumed to be making rational choices.
But even back then, legal systems had this idea that some people just weren't rational, right? That they couldn't be held accountable in the same way.
Absolutely. This concept of insanity, a state of mind that removes rationality and therefore prevents legal accountability, has a really long history.
The source mentions Bracton way back in the 12th century.
Yeah, Bracton described the insane as being without sense and reason. His comparison was striking. He said they could no more commit a tort or a felony than a brute animal.
Wow. That really highlights this long-standing idea that a fundamental lack of reason changes everything in terms of legal responsibility.
It does. And while they might not have been seen as criminally liable in the same way, they were often still seen as needing some form of control for society's protection.
Which evolved over time from maybe a king's pardon to more formal systems.
Exactly. Into different kinds of control regimes. So modern legal systems build on this. They allow pleas of insanity not as an excuse to just walk away, but as a formal defense or a mitigating factor.
And the big case here, the one everyone needs to remember, is M. Knighton, right?
Absolute central. R.V. M. Knighton, 1843. That's R.V. M. Knighton, 1843, 8 ER 718. This case is foundational in common law.
And it gave us the M. Knighton rules.
That's right, the M. Knighton rules. They establish a specific legal test for criminal liability when the defendant has a mental disorder.
What was the core of that test again?
Essentially, the defense had to prove that at the time of the act, due to a disease of the mind, they were laboring under such a defective reason that they either didn't know the nature and quality of the act they were doing,
So they didn't understand what they were physically doing.
right? Or if they did know what they were doing, they didn't know it was legally wrong. That's the crucial distinction in the Imnaten test.
Okay, the Imnaten rules, not knowing the nature quality of the act or not knowing it was wrong. Got it.
And if someone was found not guilty by reason of insanity, or sometimes guilty but insane, depending on the place and time,
It didn't usually mean they walked free, did it?
no, not typically. It usually led to being sent to a secure mental hospital or a similar facility, often for an indeterminate period. They'd stay until deemed no longer a danger.
Which raises other issues, doesn't it? The source mentions concerns about institutions like asylums becoming dumping grounds.
Yes, that's a serious historical concern. These places sometimes housed not just people with clear mental illnesses, but also individuals who just didn't fit societal norms or whose conditions weren't well understood then.
And there's still that link today, the high rate of mental illness in prison populations.
It's a persistent issue, absolutely. The whole question of how we define, label, and manage people based on perceived psychological difference became a really hot topic culturally in the 60s and 70s.
The source points to the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from 1975 as a key cultural moment reflecting that unease.
A very powerful example, yes. It captured that societal anxiety about institutionalization, about labels, about who decides who is mad or sane.
And that cultural anxiety mirrors an academic problem, too. We use words like good, evil, normal, bad, mad all the time.
But defining them rigorously is incredibly difficult. The boundaries are fuzzy, unstable, yet these simple labels are everywhere in popular media, aren't they? Films, TV shows, news.
Which leads to this idea of hyperreality, right? Where the media version becomes almost more real than reality.
Exactly. Thinkers like Baudrillard and Eco talked about this. The source quotes Brown from 2003 on that hybridization of news and fiction, especially on TV. Infotainment, faction. It gets harder to tell what's real and what's drama.
But Richard Rorty had a different take, didn't he? He saw storytelling as fundamental to being human.
He did. Rorty argued in 1989 that we are storytelling creatures. He believed social solidarity, empathy, understanding each other comes more from the stories we tell about people and their problems than from abstract theories.
But he also warned against trying to create rigid definitions of human, using them like yardsticks.
A strong warning. He argued that kind of thinking historically led to dehumanization, justifying cruelty, citing Aristotle on slavery, Hitler on Jews as examples where defining groups as less human had horrific consequences.
So for Rorty, language matters hugely. It can humanize or dehumanize. He even classified books based on whether they help us become autonomous or help us become less cruel.
Less cruel, by helping us see how social practices affect others, or how our own actions impact people around us. It's about perspective taking, fostered through narrative.
Which brings us right back to crime fiction. Shows like Law and Order, books, they constantly present these narratives of good versus evil, victim versus perpetrator.
And the sheer scale is mind-boggling. Crime fiction sells hundreds of millions of copies every year.
The source mentions Nordic noir like Joe Nesbo's Harry Hole series, selling 20 million copies. That genre often features gritty violence, detectives battling personal demons.
Like Harry Hole's alcoholism, and often confronting secrets in communities, the consequences of silence.
Psychologically, it's that inner conflict of the detective often mirroring the guilty party that's compelling, isn't it? Plus, the relationships with the experts, forensic psychologists, pathologists.
Yes, it feeds into this huge public fascination with criminal psychology, forensics, serial killers who are often portrayed as psychopaths and offender profilers.
It creates this image, doesn't it, that psychology holds the key, that it can unlock the criminal mind, tell us who to fear.
You see it everywhere. Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs or Red Dragon, Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, films like A Clockwork Orange, the TV show Cracker with Fitz the Psychologist.
These stories tap into deep fear and fascination, often around that idea of the psychopath normal-looking but fundamentally different inside. And psychology is shown as the tool to see that difference.
But this is exactly where we need to be critical, as the source emphasizes. How accurate are these media portrayals? Are serial killers really that common? Is the psychopath of fiction the same as any clinical reality? How realistic are the depictions of forensic psychologists?
What is the actual relationship between academic psychology and criminology? It's likely much more complex and, frankly, less dramatic than TV suggests.
Absolutely. And that complexity really hits home when we look at one of the most fundamental debates in psychology: nature versus nurture. Section 5.2 in our source material tackles this head on.
Ah, yes, the classic debate. Is our behavior down to biology, our genes, our brains, nature, or is it all about how we're raised, our environment, culture, nurture?
It's perhaps the enduring question, and historically, as Carlson et al. Noted back in 1999, it was often seen as this strict either choice. You were either on team nature or team nurture.
But that's not how psychologists see it anymore, is it?
Not at all. The modern consensus is that this dichotomy is false. It's too simplistic.
So it's both.
Essentially, yes. All behaviors, abilities, personality traits, they're products of the constant interaction between both sets of factors. Biology and environment are always intertwined.
The real task isn't deciding which is more important, but how they work together.
Exactly. How do genetic predispositions interact with environmental triggers? How do experiences shape brain development? As Ridley put it in 2004, quoted in the source, human behavior has to be explained by both nature and nurture. It's about the interplay.
Okay, so applying this interactionist view to crime, early on, psychology and criminology were quite drawn to biological explanations, weren't they? The positivist school again.
There was definitely an attraction there. It seemed to promise a way to identify inherent traits, maybe find people who were born criminal in some sense.
The idea being you could study humans like animals, find laws of nature for behavior.
That was part of the appeal for some, yes. Seeing behavior as determined by individual constitution interacting with the environment, but with the Constitution playing a major role.
But the source highlights that many of those early nature approaches haven't really stood the test of time or are much more complicated, like the XYY syndrome research in the 60s.
Right. That linked an extra Y chromosome to violent crime. Some early studies suggested a link, but it was controversial, and later research showed any connection is very weak and certainly not causal in a simple way.
And William Sheldon's somatotypes in 1942, linking body type to delinquency.
Yeah, Sheldon tried to connect body builds like muscular mesomorphs with delinquent personalities. That theory just hasn't held up scientifically.
What about twin studies? The source mentions Johannes Lange in the 1920s.
Twin studies are important. Lange compared identical MZ twins who share 100% DNA with fraternal DZ twins who share about 50%.
The idea being, if identical twins are more similar in their criminal behavior than fraternal twins, it suggests a genetic influence, right? Especially if they were raised apart.
That's the logic. Lange's early work did suggest higher similarity or concordance for criminality in MZ twins. Twin studies are still used today, but we interpret the results much more cautiously now. It's incredibly hard to completely separate genes and environment.
There's also early work on biochemical and hormonal imbalances.
Yes, back in the 20s and 30s. While hormones like testosterone can influence things like aggression, the idea that simple imbalances cause crime is seen as far too simplistic now, potentially dangerous if used to justify harsh controls. It's always about complex interactions.
So despite these ideas being largely discredited or shown to be way more complex, some people still try to push the biological angle. The source mentions Wilson and Herrnstein's Crime and Human Nature from 1985.
Yes, they reproduced Sheldon's body type diagrams and argued criminals differ physically on average. It shows the persistence of seeking constitutional factors.
But the fundamental problem remains the same, doesn't it? It's almost impossible to isolate biology from all the complex social and environmental stuff.
That's the crux of it. You just can't control for everything else. Which is why the updated view, the consensus now, is that no informed scholar talks seriously about a dominating biological role or suggests people are predetermined to crime by their biology alone.
It's all about the interaction, how our biological makeup influences how we experience and respond to our environment, and how our environment in turn can influence our biology.
Precisely. Nature and nurture aren't opposing forces. They form an interacting framework. That's the key takeaway for understanding causal factors in crime today.
The source has a good prompt here. Why do you think the idea of inherited criminality has been so appealing? What are the arguments for and against it? We're thinking about why simple explanations sometimes hold such sway.
Definitely. Now, moving away from biology or pure environment, Section 5.3 takes us inside the mind with psychoanalytic theory.
And that means Sigmund Freud, right?
Freud,
Yeah.
1856-1939, is the absolute giant here. Even though he didn't write much about crime specifically, his ideas about the mind were the cornerstone for later psychoanalytic theories of crime.
His big contribution was highlighting the unconscious, those hidden desires and repressed emotions shaping our behavior.
Exactly. He showed how things we're not even aware of, often stemming from childhood, can drive our actions.
And his famous model of the mind, the id, ego, and superego. Can we quickly recap those? They're important.
Sure. First, the id, completely unconscious, primitive, instinctive. It runs on the pleasure principle, wants immediate gratification of desires like sexual urges, aggression, the basic drive for life, eros. No morality, no logic.
Pure instinct.
Pure instinct. Then the ego, most conscious, the mediator. It operates on the reality principle. It tries to satisfy the id's urges, but in realistic, socially acceptable ways, considering consequences. It balances the id against reality and the superego.
The voice of reason? Sort of.
In a way, yes. And finally, the superego, partly conscious, partly unconscious. This is our internalized morality, our conscience, the source of guilt. It develops from absorbing rules and values from parents and society. It's like an internal judge or nagging parent.
Okay, id, instinct, ego, reality, superego, morality.
And Freud saw behavior as a constant struggle between the id's demands and the superego's restrictions, with the ego trying to manage the conflict. That internal control is vital for normal functioning.
So how did psychoanalytic criminology apply this to crime?
It basically proposed that criminal acts are outward expressions of deep, buried internal conflicts. These conflicts usually stem from childhood issues, traumas, deprivations, problems in early development that mess up the ego or superego formation.
The source mentions August Acorn as one of the first to apply this, back in 1925.
Yes, Acorn worked with young delinquents. He argued that things like poverty alone couldn't explain why some kids became delinquent and others didn't. He introduced the idea of latent delinquency.
Latent delinquency, meaning an underlying tendency.
Exactly. A hidden predisposition, psychologically conditioned early on, making a child vulnerable to crime later. He thought failed early emotional relationships disrupted socialization, especially superego development. This allowed the latent delinquency, the id-driven impulses, to dominate.
Yeah.
He called this state dissocial.
So crime resulted from a failure in psychological development.
That was his view, yes.
Yeah.
As Holland summarized it in 2012, Acorn's solution was therapeutic. Provide a supportive, supervised environment to help these kids form healthy relationships and finally develop that strong superego.
Then there was John Bowlby, another really influential figure, especially his 1944 work.
Bowlby, 1907-1990, strongly linked maternal deprivation in early childhood to later antisocial behavior and delinquency.
He focused heavily on that mother-child bond, didn't he?
Critically important, he argued. Any serious rejection or separation in early life was highly problematic and seemed statistically to show up disproportionately in the backgrounds of serious delinquents.
And Bowlby's ideas, along with similar broken home theories, they actually influenced policy, right? The welfarist approach in youth justice.
They did, significantly in the 60s and 70s. There was a real push towards rehabilitation based on addressing these perceived psychological and family root causes.
But these psychoanalytic theories weren't without problems. The source lists criticisms.
Major criticisms. A big one was the lack of scientific rigor. The whole Freudian focus on unconscious drives was hard to test empirically. It was often called tautological and untestable.
Tautological meaning circular reasoning again.
Yes. The link between a crime and some hidden unconscious drive often depended heavily on the analyst's interpretation. Critics felt it was too subjective, too convoluted, not really falsifiable science.
So hard to prove or disprove, but
Yeah.
still very influential for a long time.
Undeniably, psychoanalytic thinking shaped psychology and criminology for decades, even with the criticisms.
Okay, so from internal conflicts, let's switch tracks completely. Section 5.4 moves to theories that see crime as learned, social learning, and behavioral theories.
A very different perspective. This line of thought has roots in sociology, actually, with Edwin Sutherland and the Chicago School. His theory of differential association from the 1930s was key.
Sutherland's idea was that crime, like any behavior, is learned socially, right? In small groups.
Pretty much. Learned in intimate personal groups. These groups teach you the definitions, the skills, motives, rationalizations, attitudes that are either favorable or unfavorable to breaking the law.
So if you hang out with people who think crime is okay or normal, you're more likely to learn that too.
That's the core of differential association. Though it was criticized for not explaining why people in the same environment behave differently, it seemed a bit too socially deterministic.
But it shifted the focus outside the individual.
Crucially, yes. It stressed that behavior determinants were external in the social world. This paved the way for psychological learning theories focusing on environmental stimuli.
Which connects to behaviorism and the huge influence of B.F. Skinner.
Absolutely. Skinner, 1904-1990, and his principles of operant learning from 1938-1953 were central to behaviorism's rise.
Operant learning, that's about consequences, isn't it? Rewards and punishments.
Exactly. Skinner focused on observable behavior. Operant learning says behavior is determined by its environmental consequences. Behavior followed by rewards is positively reinforced, making it more likely. Behavior followed by punishment is avoided.
The source gives the ABC of behavioral theory: antecedent, what comes before; behavior, consequence, what comes after.
A simple but powerful model. A prompts B, which leads to C.
And you can see how this applies to crime. Stealing leads to getting stuff you want, that's a reward.
Right. The material gain reinforces the stealing behavior. It's a reward-based explanation, linking back slightly to the classical idea of seeking benefits, but framed as learning.
Building on Skinner and Sutherland, the source mentions C.R. Jeffrey and differential reinforcement in 1965.
Jeffrey, and also Akers later in 1973, tried to combine Skinner's operant learning with Sutherland's differential association.
How did that work?
Jeffrey argued that yes, social norms learned from groups matter, like Sutherland said, but criminal behavior is also heavily influenced by the specific consequences, the reinforcements and punishments that the individual experiences for their actions.
So it's not just about the group's attitude, but about whether your stealing actually pays off.
Exactly. The source uses that example. The majority of crimes are concerned with stealing, where the consequences are clearly material and financial gain. The gains may therefore be seen as positively reinforcing the stealing. That direct personal reinforcement is key.
And that focus on individual learning history helped explain why people in the same environment might differ.
Yes, differential reinforcement addressed that weakness in differential association by emphasizing unique individual experiences of reward and punishment.
Now, Skinner and Jeffrey didn't focus much on internal thoughts, did they? But Albert Bandura did.
He did. Bandura, 1973-1976, brought cognition into the learning picture with his social learning theory.
His big idea was observational learning, learning by watching.
Precisely. He argued, we don't just learn from our own consequences, we learn cognitively by observing others, imitating role models.
The Bobo doll experiment is the famous one here, isn't it?
Classic study. Kids watched an adult attack an inflatable doll.
Ah.
Later, those kids were much more likely to copy the specific aggressive acts than kids who hadn't seen the model.
Proving we can learn aggression just by watching.
Yes, even without being directly rewarded for it initially.
Yeah.
Bandura's concept of learned aggression was very influential in criminological psychology.
And this learning isn't just from family or friends, but from media too, TV characters, etc.
Absolutely. Bandura stressed learning from cultural symbols and media models. The source gives that example of a child learning to shoot by imitating TV, then practicing with toy guns.
And then that learned behavior gets reinforced by peers, maybe.
Right. As the Barkle and Bartol quote says, the behavior is maintained if peers also play with guns and reinforce each other. So observation starts it, reinforcement keeps it going.
But even with Bandura, the focus started to shift again by the late 70s, towards personality traits.
It did. Many criminal psychologists moved away from purely learning models towards identifying stable personality characteristics.
Which brings us to the activity prompt for this section. Think about your own life. Where have you seen social or behavioral learning? Reinforcement, association, media models. Makes it very real.
It does. And that shift takes us neatly into section 5.5, trait-based personality theories.
So this is about identifying stable personality characteristics that might predispose someone to crime.
Exactly. Identifying traits, classifying them, measuring them, seeing how they cluster differently in people.
And the key figure here is Hans Eysenck.
Eysenck, 1916-1997, is absolutely central. His work, Eysenck, 1977, Eysenck and Gudjonsson, 1989, relied heavily on psychometric testing, using questionnaires to measure personality dimensions statistically.
And he wasn't keen on the sociological explanations that were becoming popular in criminology.
Not at all. He strongly pushed back against that, emphasizing what he saw as the fundamental role of inherited genetic predispositions. Differences in our nervous systems, he argued, affected how we responded to environmental conditioning.
So back towards nature, in a way, though the source says it was more of a fusion.
He saw it as a fusion biology, environment, individual factors, but he gave genetics a very large role in personality, including criminal traits.
What were his main personality dimensions? Lanier and Henry's summary in the source mentions 3.
Yes. First, introversion, extroversion. Introverts being sensitive, inhibited. Extroverts outward-focused, expressive. Second, neuroticism, which is about emotional stability versus instability.
And the third one was psychoticism, added later.
Yes, psychoticism. He linked this to a predisposition towards psychotic breakdown, but also traits like aggression, impulsivity, lack of empathy.
And how did Eysenck link these dimensions to crime?
He argued that normal personalities were stable, low neuroticism, and balanced on the introversion-extroversion scale.
Okay.
But people high on neuroticism, unstable, high on extroversion, sensation-seeking, and especially high on psychoticism, had a greater predisposition to crime.
That combination, high N, high E, high P, was his psychopathic personality.
That was his model for the extreme end, yes. His reasoning involved several points.
Like sensation seeking. High E and P needing more stimulation, finding it in crime.
Yes, less sensitive nervous systems needing bigger thrills. Also, high N meant impulsivity, emotional instability. He thought they were harder to condition socially, maybe had higher pain tolerance. Low IQ could also play a role in not learning rules or consequences.
It sounds like a neat package, linking biology, personality, and crime. But how did the evidence stack up?
That's where it gets tricky. Studies testing his ideas produced ambiguous results. There were methodological and theoretical criticisms.
Did any parts get support?
There was some general support for offenders scoring higher on psychoticism and neuroticism. That link seemed somewhat consistent.
But not the extroversion link.
Very little evidence supported the specific crime-extroversion connection. That part of the theory didn't really hold up well empirically.
And the big criticism, again, tautology, circular reasoning.
Yes, that charge was frequently leveled, as Lanier and Henry put it. Stealing may be taken as an indicator of impulsiveness, and impulsiveness given as the reason for stealing. You define the trait by the behavior, then use the trait to explain the behavior.
Gottfredson and Hershey made a similar point about the overlap and not being able to measure traits independently of the X. So it's correlation, not necessarily causation.
Exactly. It shows traits and behaviors go together, but doesn't clearly prove the trait causes the behavior in a straightforward way.
Despite these issues, Eysenck's approach influenced the use of personality tests, didn't it? Psychometric questionnaires.
Massively. The idea took hold that you could measure specific traits through these assessments and potentially predict or prevent future deviant behavior.
Though measuring personality with stats and self-reports has its own pitfalls, as Taylor et al. Pointed out.
Definitely. Self-report bias is a huge issue. But Eysenck's approach really embodied this strong belief and unflinching faith, the source calls it in psychology, as a positivist science, using empirical, quantitative methods.
And this created a big split with criminology, which was moving in a different direction in the 60s and 70s, towards social structures.
A deep wedge. While Eysenck focused on individual traits, criminology, influenced by Marxist ideas like Taylor, Walton, and Jung's Panners, the new criminology, 1973, turned towards sociological and political economic explanations. Inequality, power, social systems.
So the two fields were barely talking to each other. As Holland suggested, no point of contact.
For a time, they were on very different paths. Psychology pursuing the individual empirical route, critical criminology looking at broader social forces.
Which leads to that provocative activity prompt. Could you argue psychology isn't really a science? Makes you think about what science means when studying complex human beings.
It certainly does. But psychology didn't stop there. The next wave, covered in section 5.6, shifted focus again, this time to thinking processes, cognitive theories of crime.
So not drives, not learning, not traits, but how people think. Problem solving, interpretation, decision-making.
Exactly. Investigating mental processes, intelligence, memory, perception, logic, the internal self-talk we use to navigate the world.
And a key study here was Yelkelson and Saminow's The Criminal Personality from 1976.
Yes, a very ambitious study.
Mm-hmm.
They aimed to map the criminal mind with real positivist zeal, believing they could empirically identify criminal thinking patterns.
Saminow wanted to expose myths, paint a picture of how criminals think, justify actions, exploit help.
That was the goal. Their method involved thousands of hours of interviews, but, and this is crucial, their sample was only 240 offenders, all found not guilty by reasoned insanity and institutionalized.
A very specific group, not representative of all offenders.
Not at all. But based on this group, they claimed to identify 52 errors of criminal thinking, or problematic thinking styles, that they argued made up the criminal personality.
What kind of errors? The source lists examples.
Things like chronic lying, irresponsible decision-making, super-optimism, thinking they'll always succeed or get away with it, distorted self-image, and importantly, a lack of empathy for others. That empathy deficit idea is still very relevant in treatment today, especially for sex offenders.
Based on these 52 errors, Saminow made some strong claims. Criminals think differently from responsible people.
Even more strongly, crime resides within the person and is caused by the way he thinks, not by his environment.
Wow, that really locates the problem entirely inside the individual's head.
It does. And the implication for treatment was obvious. If thinking causes crime, fix the thinking. Cognitive theory has had its biggest impact on offender treatment programs.
But Yochelson and Samanow's original work faced major criticisms too, didn't it? Similar problems to trait theories.
Yes. Firstly, lumping all criminals together. Do embezzlers have the same 52 thinking errors as violent offenders? The theory didn't differentiate well.
They also downplayed environment and biology almost completely.
Right. And again, the tautology issue. Were the thinking errors inferred from the criminal acts, then used to explain those same acts? It seemed circular.
And the biggest issue, the sample. Only 240 offenders, all judged NGRI and institutionalized. How could you generalize that to all crime?
You really couldn't. It severely limited the generalizability. But despite these flaws, some core ideas, especially about distorted reasoning in relationships and lack of empathy, were compelling. Other researchers refined the cognitive approach.
And the core idea behind the treatment programs that followed is that this erroneous thinking can be corrected.
Yes. The assumption is that these faulty patterns are learned and can be unlearned. Programs teach offenders to analyze their thoughts, construct a moral inventory, identify dysfunctional cognitions, and replace them with more pro-social ones.
What specific things do these programs usually target?
Often things like poor self-control, lack of empathy, especially for victims, poor social problem-solving, misinterpreting social cues, not understanding internal versus external control.
And these cognitive programs are widely used now in the UK, for instance.
Very much so. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and similar approaches are standard in prisons and probation services.
Have they been successful?
They often have shown success in reducing certain types of reoffending for specific groups. They provide practical skills.
But they have limitations too. The source points out they don't explain the origins of crime or why people stop, and they ignore bigger social issues.
That's a key critique. They tend to bracket out traditional criminological concerns like class, race, gender, poverty. The focus stays tightly on the individual's thinking.
Leading to this distillation of crime into semi-rigid narratives and making the offender solely responsible for their bad thinking.
That's one interpretation. Garland saw these practices as part of a broader shift towards individual-level control and pacification, with psychologists acting as arbiters of correct thinking.
The activity prompt here is pointed. Is crime just bad thinking? Can thinking be fixed in isolation? And it asks about narrative therapy.
Which provides a perfect bridge to our final section 5.7 on contemporary narrative approaches.
So this moves beyond just fixing thinking errors. It's about the stories people tell.
Exactly. Narrative therapy, drawing on work like Adshead's mentioned in the source, their dark materials, focuses on the idea that our sense of self is built from the stories, the narratives we construct about our lives and experiences.
Our identity is tied to our story.
Precisely. And Adshead emphasizes how this is key in mental health recovery and change, because narratives aren't fixed, they're dynamic.
So you can help people change their story, change their self-perception.
That's the potential. Narratives are complex, layered, they integrate different viewpoints, they acknowledge change over time. By helping someone restory their experiences, you can facilitate change.
Why is this narrative approach so important in the mental health recovery movement?
Several reasons. It values personal lived experience over just clinical labels. Telling your own story is seen as key to recovery. Think of the 12-step programs like AA, which use personal narrative centrally.
And recovery itself implies change is possible, right? Unlike a fixed diagnosis.
Exactly. The story of living with schizophrenia can change, even if the diagnosis doesn't. Narrative approaches embrace that potential for growth and transformation.
Now, looping back to that public fascination, Activity 5.6 brings up the focus on serial killers, often seen as the archetypal psychopath or sociopath.
Yes, that popular image is incredibly strong. The psychopath is cold, emotionless, lacking conscience, unable to empathize.
And the sociopath view is similar, self-centered, unable to see victims' perspectives, maybe not understanding why killing is wrong or just not caring if it benefits them, possibly delusional.
These popular conceptions fuel a huge market for books trying to explain them. The source mentions Robert Hare's Without Conscience, his book with Babiak Snakes in Suits about workplace psychopaths, and John Ronson's The Psychopath Test.
The description of Hare's Without Conscience captures that mix of repulsion and intrigue, mentioning Bundy and Gacy. It says psychopaths know right from wrong but are remorseless, self-centered, unable to care, often seem normal.
And importantly, that they aren't always killers. They can be con artists, manipulators. Hare portrays them as predators using charm and lies.
And the book asks those key questions, mad or bad, how to spot them, how to protect ourselves. It offers solid info.
Which leads to that critical reflection prompt. How real is this risk? Is the popular psychopath partly a cultural fiction, a way to simplify complex fears?
The source uses Charles Manson as an example, a cultural icon, a mass killer by direction, but endlessly debated.
Was he pure evil? Was he made by the system? Does he make sense? Is he technically a psychopath? Thinking about Manson forces us to question our labels, linking back to that difficulty defining bad and mad we started with.
It's complex. The source finishes with some really useful self-assessment questions for listeners, especially students. First, outline the main differences and similarities between all the psychological explanations we've covered.
Psychoanalytic, learning, trait, cognitive, narrative. How do they compare and contrast? Where do they overlap?
Second, think about different types of crime, from minor theft to murder. Which theory seems to fit best for explaining different types of crime? Does one size fit all?
A great exercise to test understanding. So to quickly recap our journey today,
We started with the historical context. Classical versus positivist views, the legal idea of insanity, and the crucial M'Naghten rules, 1843.
then the big nature versus nurture debate, moving from simple determinism to today's interactionist view, noting discredited ideas like XYY and somatotypes.
We covered psychoanalytic theories, Freud's Idigo superego, Acorn's latent delinquency, Bowlby's maternal deprivation.
Then social learning and behavioral theories, Sutherland's differential association, Skinner's operant learning, Jeffrey's differential reinforcement, Bandura's social learning theory crime, as learned.
Trait-based theories, Eysenck's E, N, P dimensions, the psychopathic personality, psychometrics, and the tautology critique.
Cognitive theories, Yokelson Samanow's criminal thinking errors, treatment focused on correcting cognitions, but limitations regarding sample and scope.
And finally, contemporary narrative approaches, focusing on stories, recovery, change, contrasting with the popular, often simplified image of the psychopath.
The big message from the source is that psychology does offer valuable insights, but popular claims are often overblown. Media myths about criminal psychology abound, and we've only scratched the surface of relevant psychological theories.
And psychology's role isn't just theoretical explanation, it's practical too, helping police, profiling though often hyped, pretrial assessments, offender rehabilitation, research on eyewitnesses. It's embedded in the justice system.
Bartle, Capartis, Adler of the Source, mentions them for more in these practical roles.
So a final thought to leave you with. Reflect on that constant tension. Is crime mainly about something inside the individual, bad thinking, flawed personality, biology? Or is it more about external factors, environment, learning, social structures?
And consider what our cultural fascination with figures like the psychopath says about us. Does it reveal a desire for simple answers to deeply complex and troubling questions about human behavior? Something to mull over.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into psychology and crime. We hope it's given you a clearer framework for understanding these diverse and often competing perspectives.
Yeah, it's been great exploring this with you. Until next time.